The gaslight flickered against the heavy damask wallpaper of the nursery in Leamington Spa, casting shadows that would dance like the very demons young Edward Alexander Crowley had been taught to fear. Born on the 12th of October in 1875, the child who would one day proclaim himself the Great Beast entered a world of rigid Victorian propriety, where even the furniture seemed to judge moral failings. His parents, Edward and Emily Crowley, belonged to that most austere of Christian denominations, the Plymouth Brethren, whose members believed themselves to be living in the final days before Christ would return to judge the living and the dead. The Crowley household operated on biblical time. Morning prayers commenced before dawn, evening devotions stretched past sunset, and between these poles of worship, the family fortune quietly accumulated from the Crowley Ales brewery business that Edward Sr. had inherited and converted into a tool for evangelism. The irony that their wealth flowed from the very intoxicants the Plymouth Brethren condemned was lost on neither father nor son, though they drew different conclusions from this contradiction. Edward Crowley Sr. was no ordinary religious zealot. He travelled extensively throughout Britain, preaching to anyone who would listen, distributing pamphlets that warned of hellfire with the same enthusiasm other men might show for cricket scores. He possessed that particular Victorian combination of absolute certainty and genuine kindness that made him both admirable and insufferable. Young Edward Alexander, whom the family called Alec, absorbed these sermons like a sponge absorbs water, though what would eventually wring out of him would bear little resemblance to what went in. The boy showed an early fascination with the Book of Revelation, that cosmic horror story tucked at the back of the Bible. While other children might have nightmares about its seven-headed beasts and lakes of fire, Alec found himself oddly drawn to these images of destruction and transformation. He would trace his fingers over the illustrated plates in the family Bible, lingering particularly on the whore of Babylon and the beast, whose number was 666. His mother, catching him at this practice, would snap the book shut and remind him that good Christian boys focused on the Gospels, not the apocalyptic visions that God intended only for the spiritually mature. Emily Crowley was carved from sterner stuff than her husband. Where Edward Sr. led through charisma and example, Emily ruled through fear and privation. She belonged to that species of religious woman who viewed joy itself as slightly suspect, a potential gateway to sin that required constant vigilance to suppress. She loved her son, certainly, but it was the anxious, controlling love of someone who believed that any moment of inattention might result in his eternal damnation. The dynamic between his parents created a peculiar psychological pressure chamber for young Alec. His father represented the ecstatic, mystical aspect of Christianity, the direct communication with the divine, the speaking in tongues, and prophetic visions that occasionally manifested during particularly intense prayer meetings. His mother embodied the punitive, restrictive side, the endless catalogue of prohibitions, and the subtle art of finding sin in the most innocent pleasures. Between these two poles, the boy began to develop his own understanding of the sacred and profane. School offered no escape from religious instruction. The Plymouth Brethren operated their own educational institutions, where Latin and Greek served primarily as tools for better understanding Scripture in its original tongues. Mathematics was taught because God was orderly, but poetry was viewed with suspicion unless it praised the Almighty. Young Crowley excelled at his studies, displaying a memory that could retain entire chapters of text after a single reading and a facility with languages that impressed even his doctrinally rigid teachers. Everything changed when Edward Sr. died on March 5, 1887. The man who had been the warmer, more mystical influence in Alec's life succumbed to tongue cancer, a particularly cruel fate for someone whose life had been dedicated to preaching. The 11-year-old boy stood at the bedside, watching his father struggle to speak through the ravages of disease, trying to deliver one final sermon, but producing only gurgling sounds that might have been glossolalia, or might have been nothing at all. The death shattered something in the boy. Not his faith exactly, but his willingness to accept faith on the terms offered by his mother and the Plymouth Brethren. Emily, grief-stricken and fearful for her son's soul, tightened her grip, instituting even stricter rules and longer prayer sessions. She began referring to Alec as her little beast when he showed any sign of rebellion, unknowingly planting a seed that would flourish in ways she could never imagine. The adolescent Crowley began to test boundaries with scientific precision. He would commit small transgressions, carefully calibrated to provoke response without inviting total catastrophe. He smuggled secular books into his room, hiding penny dreadfuls and scientific treatises under his mattress like other boys might hide French postcards. He discovered that he could induce a state of consciousness through prolonged prayer that felt distinctly different from religious ecstasy, something more akin to the dissolution of self that he would later recognize in Eastern meditative practices. His mother, detecting this shift in her son's spiritual alignment, made a fateful decision. She enrolled him in a series of increasingly strict religious schools, each promising to correct his wayward tendencies. The Ebor School in Cambridge, run by a Plymouth Brethren fanatic named Champney, proved particularly traumatic. Champney believed in breaking the will through systematic humiliation and physical punishment. Students were encouraged to inform on each other's sins, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. Rather than breaking him, this experience taught Crowley valuable lessons about power, control, and the malleability of human consciousness under extreme conditions. He observed how confession could become addiction, how the cycle of sin and redemption created its own psychological dependence. He noticed which boys broke under the pressure, and which ones found ways to maintain secret inner lives despite the surveillance. He was developing, without knowing it, the observational skills of an anthropologist studying religious extremism from within. A brief reprieve came when illness forced his removal from Ebor. A doctor, concerned about the boy's physical and mental state, prescribed a radical cure: fresh air, physical exercise, and distance from religious instruction. Emily reluctantly agreed to send him to Malvern, where he could recuperate while receiving private tutoring. The tutor, a man named Archibald Douglas, introduced Crowley to a wider world of literature and ideas. Through Douglas, he discovered Shelley, Byron, and Swinburne, poets who had challenged the religious orthodoxies of their own times. The mountains around Malvern provided another kind of education. Crowley discovered he had a natural aptitude for climbing, combining physical strength with the kind of methodical planning that would characterize his later magical work. There was something about the risk, the necessary focus, the proximity to death that created states of consciousness he found more genuinely spiritual than anything he had experienced in church. On a ledge thousands of feet above the ground, with nothing but skill and will preventing a fatal fall, he felt closer to something essential than he ever had during communion. At 16, a modest inheritance from his father gave him a degree of financial independence. His mother could no longer completely control him through economic means, though she continued her attempts at spiritual coercion. He began to systematically explore everything the Plymouth Brethren had forbidden. He attended the theatre, read widely in philosophy and science, and discovered he had a particular talent for chess, which combined strategic thinking with psychological warfare in ways that appealed to his developing sensibilities. The decision to attend Trinity College, Cambridge, represented both a concession to respectability and a declaration of independence. His mother hoped university would provide structure and moral guidance. Crowley saw it as a laboratory for self-experimentation. He arrived in October 1895, taking rooms at 16 St. John Street, and immediately set about creating a persona that would scandalize and intrigue in equal measure. Cambridge in the 1890s was experiencing its own crisis of faith. Darwin had been dead less than 15 years, but his ideas had thoroughly infected the academic establishment. Young men who had arrived as Christians were leaving as agnostics or atheists, though most maintained a veneer of conventional belief for the sake of their future careers. Crowley, characteristically, refused such hypocrisy. He openly declared his rejection of Christianity while simultaneously pursuing an intense interest in spiritual and mystical experiences. He changed his name from Alec to Aleister, a Gaelic form he believed sounded more poetic. He affected a style of dress that was just unconventional enough to mark him as different without violating university regulations. He wrote poetry, much of it erotically charged and blasphemous, which he published at his own expense. He pursued women and men with equal enthusiasm, treating sexual experience as another form of consciousness exploration. The mountaineering continued, now with more ambitious targets. He joined the Scottish Mountaineering Club and began tackling peaks that required technical skill and physical endurance. During a particularly challenging climb in the Lake District, he experienced what he would later describe as his first genuine mystical experience. Exhausted, oxygen-deprived, pushed to his physical limits, he suddenly felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his body. For a few moments, he was not Aleister Crowley clinging to a rock face, but something vastly larger, older, and more significant. This experience haunted and thrilled him. It suggested that the mystics and saints might have been onto something real, even if their interpretation of it through Christian theology was limited and distorted. He began reading more widely in mystical literature, discovering that similar experiences had been recorded across cultures and centuries. The Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, the works of the Sufi poets all described states of consciousness that resembled what he had experienced on that mountain. His academic studies suffered from these extracurricular interests. He had enrolled to read natural sciences, but found himself drawn more to the Cambridge University Chess Club and the Footlights Dramatic Club than to his lectures. He was developing a theory that conventional education was designed to produce a specific type of consciousness, one suited to maintaining the social and economic order, but antithetical to genuine spiritual development. The examination system, with its emphasis on regurgitation of accepted facts, seemed to him a mechanism for creating intellectual conformity. During his second year at Cambridge, he encountered a book that would change the trajectory of his life. The Book of Black Magic and of Pacts, by Arthur Edward Waite, presented a scholarly examination of grimoires and magical texts. While Waite himself was skeptical of magic's efficacy, treating it more as a historical and psychological curiosity, Crowley read between the lines and sensed something more. Here was a tradition, hidden but persistent, that claimed direct experience of spiritual realities was possible through specific practices and techniques. He began experimenting with the rituals described in various occult texts, adapting them to his own psychological and aesthetic sensibilities. His rooms at Cambridge became a laboratory for consciousness experimentation. He would fast, meditate, burn incense, and perform elaborate ceremonies designed to produce specific mental states. Some of these experiments produced nothing but headaches and embarrassment. Others generated experiences that convinced him he was on to something significant. By his third year at Cambridge, Crowley had largely abandoned any pretense of academic study. He was wealthy enough not to need a degree for employment. London in 1898 hummed with the peculiar energy of an empire at its zenith, unaware that its decline had already begun. The city's occult underground thrived in drawing rooms and private temples, where respectable gentlemen and occasional ladies gathered to explore mysteries that the materialist age claimed did not exist. Into this world stepped Aleister Crowley, 23 years old and burning with ambition to penetrate the veils that separated ordinary consciousness from whatever lay beyond. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn operated from an unassuming address in Clydesford Street, Kensington. From the outside, it might have been any other Victorian townhouse, but within its walls, initiates claimed to practice the ancient arts of ceremonial magic, derived from Renaissance grimoires, Egyptian mysteries, and the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah. The order had been founded a decade earlier by 3 Freemasons who claimed to have received their charter from a mysterious German adept named Fräulein Sprengel, whose existence remains doubtful to this day. Crowley's introduction to the Golden Dawn came through Julian Baker, a chemist he had met through mountaineering circles. Baker mentioned, almost casually, that he belonged to a society that studied practical occultism. The word practical caught Crowley's attention. He had read enough theoretical occultism to choke a library, but here was someone claiming actual results, genuine experiences rather than mere philosophical speculation. The initiation ceremony, conducted on November 18, 1898, was theatre of the highest order. Blindfolded, bound with cords, a dagger pressed to his chest, Crowley was led through symbolic death and rebirth. The officers of the lodge, dressed in elaborate robes and bearing titles like Hierophant and Hegemon, guided him through passwords, signs, and oaths. He swore to maintain secrecy about the order's teachings on pain of a deadly and hostile current of will set in motion by the chiefs of the order, by which I should fall slain or paralyzed without visible weapon. For someone raised in the Plymouth Brethren, where ritual was stripped to its barest bones, the Golden Dawn's elaborate ceremonies were intoxicating. Here was religion as art, spirituality as performance, magic as a technology of consciousness. The initiation left him physically exhausted but mentally exhilarated. He had found his university, though its curriculum would prove far stranger than anything offered at Cambridge. The Golden Dawn operated on a grade system, with students progressing from neophyte through various degrees named after the spheres of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. Each grade required mastery of specific knowledge and practices. The neophyte learned basic meditation and visualization. The zealotor studied astrological correspondences. The theoricus memorized Hebrew letters and their mystical meanings. The system was designed to gradually transform consciousness, replacing ordinary awareness with a magical worldview where everything connected to everything else through invisible correspondences. Crowley attacked these studies with characteristic intensity. His exceptional memory, honed through years of biblical memorization, served him well. Within weeks he could recite the Hebrew alphabet backwards while visualizing the tarot cards associated with each letter. He mastered the art of assuming god forms, imaginatively transforming himself into Egyptian deities while vibrating their names in ways that made his whole body resonate. He learned to see auras, though whether this was genuine clairvoyance or trained hallucination remained an open question. The intellectual framework of the Golden Dawn synthesized Western esoteric traditions into a remarkably coherent system. Everything had correspondences. The planet Mars connected to the Hebrew letter Peh, the tarot card the Tower, the color red, the metal iron, and the god Horus. By manipulating these symbols through ritual, one could theoretically influence the forces they represented. It was a magical periodic table, a systematic attempt to catalogue and control the invisible forces that shaped reality. Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, one of the order's founders and its chief instructor, recognized Crowley's talent immediately. Mathers was a peculiar figure, even by Golden Dawn standards. He claimed to be the descendant of Scottish nobility, affected Highland dress, and insisted on being addressed as MacGregor of Glenstray. He lived in Paris with his wife Moyna, sister of the philosopher Henry Bergson, surviving on a stipend from Annie Horniman, a tea heiress and fellow Golden Dawn member. Mathers saw in Crowley not just a talented student, but a potential heir to his magical authority. He began providing personal instruction, teaching Crowley advanced techniques that were normally reserved for much higher grades. This favoritism did not go unnoticed by other members, creating resentments that would later explode into open conflict. William Butler Yeats, the Irish poet and fellow member, took particular exception to Crowley, finding him vulgar and dangerous. The tension between Crowley and Yeats represented larger conflicts within the order. Yeats approached magic as a source of poetic inspiration and national mythology. Crowley wanted power, knowledge, and direct experience of divine consciousness. Yeats sought to elevate, Crowley sought to transform. During one memorable meeting, Crowley proposed an experiment to render the members invisible, while Yeats argued for a discussion of Celtic symbolism in the tarot. Neither man could understand how the other could waste time on such trivialities. Alan Bennett proved a more compatible mentor. A chemist by training and Buddhist by inclination, Bennett lived in conditions of extreme poverty, dedicating himself entirely to spiritual pursuits. His flat in Chancery Lane was laboratory, temple, and opium den combined. Chemical apparatus shared space with Buddha statues, while the smell of incense barely masked the acrid odor of various experimental compounds. Bennett introduced Crowley to the practical side of consciousness alteration. Together they experimented with hashish, mescaline, and various combinations of drugs designed to produce specific magical states. Bennett had developed a scientific approach to these substances, carefully recording dosages, effects, and the visions they produced. He taught Crowley that drugs were tools, potentially useful but ultimately limited, crutches that could help one glimpse higher states but could not sustain them. Under Bennett's guidance, Crowley began experiencing phenomena that challenged his materialist assumptions. During one session, after consuming a carefully prepared mixture of hashish and prescribed ritual work, he found himself apparently outside his body, observing it from above while simultaneously aware of being in multiple locations. On another occasion, he successfully predicted, in detail, the contents of a letter before opening it, though whether this was precognition or unconscious deduction remained unclear. The relationship between Crowley and Bennett went beyond teacher and student. They shared a flat for several months, during which Bennett's health deteriorated dramatically. He suffered from severe asthma, which the London fog exacerbated to life-threatening levels. Crowley would sit up nights with him, performing healing rituals while Bennett gasped for breath. These vigils, suspended between life and death, magic and medicine, deepened Crowley's understanding of the fragility of human consciousness. Bennett's decision to travel to Ceylon to study Buddhism and recover his health left Crowley without his closest magical companion. Before departing, Bennett performed a final service, introducing Crowley to the Goetia, a grimoire supposedly written by King Solomon that detailed the evocation of 72 demons. Most Golden Dawn members considered such operations too dangerous for anyone below the highest grades. Bennett disagreed. Danger, properly approached, was education. The first evocation was a disaster. Following the Goetia's instructions, Crowley traced a magic circle on his apartment floor, lit the prescribed incense, and began the lengthy conjuration. Hours passed. Nothing manifested except a terrible smell and complaints from the neighbors. He tried again and again, each time refining his technique, adjusting his mental state, experimenting with different approaches to the archaic language of the invocations. Success, when it came, was ambiguous. During his fifth attempt at evoking a spirit called Beulah, who supposedly taught moral philosophy and healing, Crowley experienced a presence in the room. The temperature dropped, the candles flickered in a non-existent wind, and he heard, or thought he heard, a voice speaking in a language he did not recognize, but somehow understood. Whether he had contacted an independent entity or activated some deep layer of his own psyche remained an open question, one that would occupy him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the Golden Dawn was tearing itself apart. Personal conflicts, financial disputes, and battles over magical authority created an atmosphere of paranoia and recrimination. Mathers, increasingly autocratic, demanded absolute obedience from members. When they resisted, he claimed to be in contact with secret chiefs, hidden masters who directed the order from the astral plane. His opponents countered that these secret chiefs were figments of his imagination, or worse, demonic entities leading him astray. The conflict came to a head in early 1900. A group of London members, led by Yeats and Florence Farr, an actress and theatrical producer, voted to expel Mathers from the order he had helped found. Mathers, from his Parisian exile, refused to acknowledge their authority. He claimed that the real Golden Dawn continued under his leadership, while the London group was in rebellion against cosmic law. Crowley sided with Mathers, partly from loyalty to his teacher, but mainly because he enjoyed chaos. When Mathers appointed him his representative in London with authority over all British members, Crowley embraced the role with theatrical enthusiasm. He appeared at the Order's temple in full Highland dress, claiming the right to take possession of the property and magical implements. The rebels, unimpressed, called the police. The resulting scene was farce-worthy of Gilbert and Sullivan. Crowley, in kilt and sporran, arguing about astral authority with Yeats, while a bemused constable tried to determine whether any actual laws had been broken. The incident made minor news in the gossip columns, marking Crowley's first appearance in the press as an occult figure. The publicity horrified most Golden Dawn members who valued secrecy, but Crowley found he rather enjoyed the attention. Disgusted with what he saw as the pettiness of the London members, Crowley accepted Mathers's invitation to visit Paris. The French capital in 1900 was celebrating the Exposition Universelle, showcasing the achievements of the dying century and the promise of the new one. Against this backdrop of technological optimism, Crowley delved deeper into ancient magical practices under Mathers's direct supervision. Mathers had access to manuscript collections in Parisian libraries that contained magical texts unavailable in England. He set Crowley to work transcribing and translating these documents, particularly those related to Abramelin the Mage, a medieval Jewish mystic who claimed to have achieved conversation with his holy guardian angel. This operation, which required 6 months of isolation and increasingly intense ritual work, was considered the supreme achievement of Western ceremonial magic. The relationship between Mathers and Crowley grew increasingly complex. Mathers needed Crowley's money and energy to maintain his position. Crowley needed Mathers's knowledge and magical authority. Yet each man recognized in the other a potential rival. Mathers was the past, maintaining traditions and hierarchies inherited from previous generations. Crowley was the future, ready to tear down old structures and build something entirely new. Living in Paris, Crowley also explored the city's artistic and decadent communities. The steamship that carried Crowley away from European shores in 1900 might as well have been Charon's ferry, transporting him from one world to another. His destination was Mexico, chosen partly for its reputation as a land where ancient magical traditions survived beneath a veneer of Catholicism, and partly because it was as far from the Golden Dawn's petty squabbles as he could reasonably travel. He had read accounts of Aztec sorcerers and Mayan mysteries, of peyote visions and blood sacrifices that made European ceremonial magic seem like parlor games. Mexico City at the turn of the century was experiencing its own transformation under Porfirio Diaz, modernizing rapidly while indigenous traditions retreated to the margins. Crowley took rooms in a colonial-era hotel and immediately set about exploring both aspects of the city. By day, he visited museums and archaeological sites, studying pre-Columbian artifacts with the eye of someone looking for practical, magical knowledge rather than historical curiosity. By night, he sought out curanderos and brujos, offering gold for initiation into mysteries that were not for sale. His most significant Mexican experiment involved climbing Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the volcanic peaks that dominated the valley. These mountains were not technically challenging for someone with his experience, but the altitude and isolation provided perfect conditions for magical work. On Popocatépetl slopes at over 15,000 feet, he performed an invocation to the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, lord of conflict and change. Whether it was oxygen deprivation or genuine contact with ancient forces, he experienced visions of such intensity that he could barely distinguish them from physical reality. Oscar Eckenstein arrived in Mexico in early 1901, summoned by Crowley's letters describing the country's mountaineering possibilities. Eckenstein was everything the Golden Dawn magicians were not. A railway engineer by profession and atheist by conviction, he approached climbing with scientific precision. He had invented the modern crampon and developed systematic training methods that treated mountaineering as an athletic discipline rather than romantic adventure. He regarded Crowley's magical interests with amused skepticism, but respected his climbing abilities and iron will. Under Eckenstein's influence, Crowley began applying similar scientific rigor to his magical practices. Rather than accepting traditional instructions uncritically, he started developing controlled experiments. If a ritual claimed to produce a specific result, he would perform it multiple times under varying conditions, documenting every detail. If an incantation was supposed to summon a particular entity, he would test whether the words themselves mattered or whether the psychological state they induced was the active ingredient. Together they explored Mexico's volcanic peaks, using the expeditions as training for a more ambitious project Eckenstein had been planning for years. He wanted to attempt K2, the world's second highest mountain, which had never been climbed and had barely been explored. The mountain represented the ultimate test of human will against natural forces, a prospect that appealed to Crowley for reasons both athletic and metaphysical. Before committing to the K2 expedition, Crowley decided to visit Alan Bennett in Ceylon. His former mentor had fully embraced Buddhism, taking the name Swami Maitrananda and living in a monastery outside Colombo. The reunion was awkward at first. Bennett had abandoned Western occultism entirely, viewing it now as an elaborate distraction from the real work of achieving enlightenment through meditation and ethical conduct. Yet, as they talked, walking through tea plantations in the morning mist, Crowley began to see connections between Buddhist practices and his magical experiments. Both traditions spoke of dissolving the ego, of achieving states of consciousness where the distinction between self and universe disappeared. The Buddhist concept of emptiness resembled the magical experience of stepping outside ordinary awareness. Perhaps they were using different maps to navigate the same territory. Bennett introduced him to formal meditation practices, teaching him to observe his thoughts without attachment, to focus on breathing until awareness itself became the only object of consciousness. These exercises proved surprisingly difficult for someone who could memorize entire books and perform elaborate ceremonial rituals. Sitting still and doing nothing required a different kind of discipline than he had previously cultivated. The monastery's senior monk, an elderly Sinhalese man who spoke excellent English, took an interest in this unusual Western student. He assigned Crowley increasingly challenging meditation exercises, pushing him to maintain awareness for hours at a time. During one session, after 3 days of continuous practice with minimal sleep, Crowley achieved what Buddhists call dhyana, a state of consciousness where subject and object merged into undifferentiated awareness. The experience lasted only moments, but left him profoundly shaken. It was more real than anything the Golden Dawn had produced, yet achieved through doing absolutely nothing. From Ceylon, Crowley travelled to India, the source of the esoteric traditions that had influenced Western occultism for centuries. The subcontinent in 1902 was the crown jewel of the British Empire, but beneath the colonial administration, ancient traditions continued largely unchanged. He visited Madras, Calcutta, and Benares, seeking out yogis and tantrics who maintained practices that predated Christ by millennia. In Benares, on the Ghats where bodies burned day and night, he met an Aghori sadhu who taught him practices that would have horrified his Plymouth Brethren mother beyond her worst nightmares. The Agori sought liberation through transgression, violating every taboo to demonstrate that all distinctions between pure and impure were illusions. They meditated in cremation grounds, used skulls as begging bowls, and consumed substances that normal Hindus considered polluting. The sadhu, speaking through a translator, explained that by embracing what others rejected, one could transcend the dualities that trapped ordinary consciousness. These extreme practices appealed to Crowley's antinomian tendencies, his desire to invert conventional morality to achieve spiritual breakthrough. He spent several nights in cremation grounds, performing rituals that combined Hindu Tantra with Western ceremonial magic. The results were disturbing even to him. He experienced visions of Kali, the destroyer goddess, that felt less like imagination and more like contact with forces that existed whether he believed in them or not. The K2 expedition began in spring 1902. Eckenstein had assembled an international team of climbers, and they approached the mountain through the Baltoro Glacier, a river of ice flowing through the Karakoram Range. The landscape was alien, a vertical desert of rock and ice where humans were not meant to exist. Every breath at altitude was effort, every step an act of will against gravity and exhaustion. Crowley thrived in these conditions. The worse things got, the stronger he seemed to become, as if adversity activated reserves of energy invisible under normal circumstances. While other team members struggled with altitude sickness and exhaustion, he maintained detailed diaries, performed daily magical rituals, and pushed for increasingly aggressive attempts at the summit. The expedition ultimately failed, turned back by weather and logistics rather than human weakness. But for Crowley, it succeeded in ways Eckenstein could never understand. The prolonged exposure to altitude, danger, and isolation had produced sustained alterations in consciousness. He found he could maintain magical awareness while performing physical tasks, existing simultaneously in multiple states of being. The mountain had been a better teacher than any human guru. Returning to India, Crowley continued his explorations of Eastern practices while beginning to synthesize them with his Western magical training. He was developing a unified theory of consciousness alteration, seeing common patterns across different traditions. Whether one called it samadhi, gnosis, or conversation with the holy guardian angel, the experience of transcending ordinary awareness seemed universal. The methods varied, but the destination remained constant. His wanderings eventually brought him to Cairo in March 1904, accompanied by his new wife, Rose Kelly. Their marriage had been one of convenience, designed to help Rose escape an arranged engagement, but had evolved into genuine affection. Rose had no interest in magic or mysticism, which paradoxically made her an ideal companion. She grounded him in ordinary reality while accepting his extraordinary pursuits without judgment. They took an apartment facing the Bulaq Museum, where ancient Egyptian artifacts whispered of mysteries older than memory. Crowley, inspired by the surroundings, decided to perform a ritual invocation of Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic. He prepared the apartment as a temple, traced the appropriate symbols, and began the lengthy invocation. Rose, who normally ignored these performances, suddenly began behaving strangely. She entered what appeared to be a trance state, speaking in a voice not quite her own, insisting that Crowley was performing the wrong ritual for the wrong god. The entity they needed to contact, she claimed, was Horus, specifically in his form as Ra-Hur-Khwit, the Lord of the New Aeon. This was particularly striking because Rose knew nothing of Egyptian mythology beyond what any educated person might absorb from museum visits. To test whether Rose was genuinely in contact with something beyond her ordinary knowledge, Crowley took her to the Bulaq Museum and asked her to identify Horus. Without hesitation, she led him to a painted wooden stele depicting Horus receiving an offering from a priest. The museum catalogue number of this otherwise unremarkable artifact was 666, the number of the beast from Revelation that had fascinated Crowley since childhood. Following Rose's instructions delivered in increasingly frequent trance states, Crowley prepared to receive a communication from this entity. On April 8, 9 and 10, 1904, at exactly noon each day, he sat at his desk in the apartment and wrote what he heard, dictated by a voice that seemed to come from over his left shoulder. The voice identified itself as Aiwas, minister of Horus, and over 3 hours delivered what would become known as the Book of the Law. The text was unlike anything Crowley had previously produced. Written in a mixture of biblical prophecy, poetic imagery, and precise technical instructions, it proclaimed the dawn of a new aeon in human spiritual evolution. The age of Osiris, characterized by dying gods and patriarchal religions, was ending. The age of Horus, the crowned and conquering child, was beginning. This new aeon would be governed by a single law, delivered in language of shocking simplicity. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. This was not, as critics would later claim, a license for hedonistic abandon. The book made clear that discovering one's true will, the fundamental purpose of one's existence, required the most rigorous discipline. Every person was a star following its unique orbit through space. Problems arose when these orbits collided because individuals had lost sight of their true trajectories. The great work of the new aeon was for each person to discover and fulfill their will, creating a universe where every star moved in harmony with its nature. The book contained other elements that disturbed even Crowley. It spoke of violence and conquest in terms that seemed to glorify war. It rejected compassion as the vice of kings, proclaimed that existence was pure joy, and insisted that every number is infinite. There is no difference. Some passages seem to be in code, referring to mathematical formulas and Kabbalistic correspondences that would take years to unravel. Others were direct commands to Crowley himself, appointing him as the prophet of the new aeon. Crowley's initial reaction was rejection. The book contradicted much of what he had learned from Buddhism about compassion and the extinction of desire. It overturned the Golden Dawn's careful hierarchies and degree systems. Most troubling, it placed him at the center of a cosmic drama he had not auditioned for. He tried to lose the manuscript, but Rose always found it. He attempted to forget the experience, but the words haunted his dreams. The Cairo working, as he would later call it, marked a decisive break in his magic. The England that Crowley returned to in 1904 seemed smaller than the one he had left. After the vast spaces of the Himalayas and the ancient mysteries of Egypt, London's occult scene appeared provincial, its practitioners playing at magic while remaining fundamentally anchored to Victorian respectability. The Book of the Law burned in his consciousness like a coal he could neither swallow nor spit out, yet he attempted to resume his previous life as if Cairo had never happened. Rose was pregnant with their first child, and for a brief period, Crowley experimented with domesticity. They took a house in Boleskine on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland, which he had purchased years earlier for its ideal positioning according to magical principles laid out in the Book of Abramelin. The house faced north toward the loch, with mountains rising behind it, creating what he believed to be a natural battery for storing and directing magical energy. Boleskine had been intended as the site for the 6-month Abramelin operation, that supreme ritual of Western magic designed to achieve knowledge and conversation of one's holy guardian angel. But the Cairo working had short-circuited that process, providing direct contact with preternatural intelligences without the prescribed months of purification and prayer. Still, the house served as a retreat where he could process what had occurred and plan his next moves. Their daughter, Lilith, was born in July 1904, named after the demon goddess of Jewish mythology who refused to submit to Adam's authority. The choice of name horrified Rose's family, but delighted Crowley, who saw in his daughter the first child of the new aeon, born just months after the reception of the Book of the Law. He doted on her with an intensity that surprised those who knew him as a libertine and rebel, and yet domestic life could not contain him for long. The Book of the Law demanded promulgation, and Crowley began to feel the weight of his prophetic responsibility. He started writing commentaries on the text, discovering layers of meaning that had not been apparent during the initial reception. Numerical correspondences, hidden Kabbalah, references to events that had not yet occurred when the book was written, all suggested an intelligence beyond his conscious mind had authored the text. The Golden Dawn, meanwhile, had splintered into competing factions, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to the original tradition. Mathers, still in Paris, insisted he alone maintain contact with the secret chiefs. The London Temple under Arthur Edward Waite had become essentially Christian, focusing on mysticism rather than magic. Other fragments pursued their own interpretations, creating a chaos that disgusted Crowley. These people had been given the keys to divine power and had chosen to squabble over who got to hold them. By 1906, Crowley had decided that entirely new magical order was necessary, one built on the principles revealed in the Book of the Law rather than the worn-out traditions of dying aeon. He began reaching out to former Golden Dawn members who might be receptive to his message. George Cecil Jones, who had been his original sponsor in the Golden Dawn, proved enthusiastic. Together they began formulating the structure of what would become the AA, a name whose meaning Crowley would never fully explain, though he hinted it stood for Argenteum Astrum, the Silver Star. The AA would differ fundamentally from the Golden Dawn in its approach to magical training. Rather than group initiations and lodge meetings, it would operate on a chain system, with each member responsible for instructing those below and reporting to the one above. This prevented the personality conflicts and political maneuvering that had destroyed the Golden Dawn. More importantly, it emphasized individual attainment over collective ritual. Each person must achieve their own gnosis. No one could be carried to enlightenment by others. The curriculum Crowley developed for the AA synthesized everything he had learned from Western and Eastern traditions. Students would master yoga and meditation alongside ceremonial magic. They would study the Kabbalah and the I Ching, Egyptian mythology, and Buddhist philosophy. Every practice would be approached scientifically with careful recording of methods and results. The goal was not to create believers, but to produce adepts who had verified spiritual truths through direct experience. To disseminate these teachings, Crowley decided to publish a periodical that would serve as both a magical journal and a work of art. The equinox would appear twice yearly at the spring and autumn equinoxes, containing instruction papers, magical records, poetry, and artwork. Its motto, the Review of Scientific Illuminism, proclaimed his intention to treat spirituality as an empirical discipline rather than a matter of faith. The first issue appeared in March 1909, a massive volume bound in white and gold that looked more like a luxury edition than an occult magazine. It contained previously secret Golden Dawn rituals, which Crowley published despite his oaths of secrecy, arguing that the order's dissolution had released him from obligation. He included his own magical records, documenting successes and failures with embarrassing honesty. Poetry and fiction illustrated magical principles through symbol and allegory. Mathers was furious at what he saw as theft and betrayal. He initiated a legal action to prevent further publication of Golden Dawn materials, claiming they were his intellectual property. The resulting court case became a sensation in the London press. Here was Samuel Mathers, dressed in full Highland regalia, arguing about the ownership of magical secrets, while Crowley, in equally flamboyant dress, insisted that spiritual knowledge could not be copyrighted. The trial transcripts read like absurdist theatre. Mathers testified about receiving teachings from secret chiefs who materialized in his apartment. Crowley described magical battles fought on the astral plane. The judge, trying to maintain judicial dignity while adjudicating disputes about demon evocation and spiritual authority, ultimately ruled that while the specific expression of the rituals might be protected, the ideas themselves were not. Crowley could continue publishing, though he was enjoined from using certain specific texts. The publicity from the trials served Crowley's purposes perfectly. The Equinox gained subscribers curious about these secrets that someone had tried to suppress. More importantly, it established Crowley in the public mind as the enfant terrible of British occultism, the man who would reveal what others wanted hidden. He cultivated this reputation, understanding that controversy generated interest and interest attracted potential students. His personal life during this period grew increasingly complex. Rose had begun drinking heavily, unable to cope with Crowley's frequent absences and bizarre pursuits. Their second daughter, Lola Zaza, was born in 1907, but the marriage was already failing. Crowley loved his daughters but seemed incapable of providing the stability they needed. He would appear with expensive gifts and fantastic stories, then disappear for months, pursuing magical operations or romantic entanglements. The death of Lilith in 1906 from typhoid contracted during a trip to Asia devastated both parents in different ways. Rose retreated further into alcoholism, blaming Crowley for exposing their daughter to dangerous conditions. Crowley channeled his grief into increasingly intense magical work, as if he could pierce the veil of death through sheer will and retrieve what had been lost. He performed rituals to contact Lilith's spirit, recording communications that might have been genuine contact or elaborate self-deception. His magical experiments became more extreme as he pushed against the boundaries of consciousness. He would spend days in ritual, consuming minimal food and water, using techniques borrowed from various traditions to induce altered states. During one operation in 1907, he achieved what he called the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, the central attainment of Western ceremonial magic. The experience, which occurred during an intensive retreat in Surrey, convinced him that the Cairo working had been genuine contact with discarnate intelligence. Yet, even this achievement felt incomplete. The Book of the Law spoke of crossing the abyss, the gap between human and divine consciousness that could only be bridged by the complete annihilation of the ego. Those who succeeded became masters of the temple, functioning as conscious agents of cosmic will. Those who failed became black brothers, trapped in their own delusions of grandeur. Crowley knew he had not yet made this crossing, though he could feel it approaching like a storm system moving in from the sea. The Equinox continued publication despite legal challenges and financial difficulties. Each issue pushed boundaries, publishing material that other occultists considered too dangerous for public consumption. Crowley included instructions for sexual magic, though veiled in symbolism that only initiates would recognize. He printed photographs of magical operations in progress, violating the traditional secrecy that had shrouded such practices. He even published negative reviews of his own work, demonstrating a commitment to intellectual honesty rare in occult circles. Through the AA and the Equinox, Crowley was creating a new approach to spirituality suited to the 20th century. Rather than appealing to ancient authority or demanding blind faith, he offered a system of graduated experiments that anyone could perform and verify for themselves. If the practices produced the promised results, students would continue. If not, they were free to seek elsewhere. This radical democratization of esoteric knowledge horrified traditional occultists, but attracted a new generation of seekers. The years between 1904 and 1910 saw Crowley transforming from a talented but dilettantish occultist into a serious magical innovator. He had received a revelation, founded an order, and begun disseminating teachings that would influence occultism for the next century. Yet success brought its own challenges. The more publicly he proclaimed the law of Thelema, the more resistance he encountered, not just from conservative society, but from within himself. Part of him still wanted to be accepted by the British establishment, to be recognized as a gentleman and scholar rather than a madman and charlatan. This desire for respectability warred with his commitment to the revolutionary message of the Book of the Law. He would attend society functions in evening dress, charming hostesses with his wit and erudition, then return home to perform rituals that would have horrified them beyond measure. Rose finally left him in 1909, taking Lola Zaza with her. The divorce proceedings were relatively civil, Crowley providing financial support despite his own perpetually precarious finances. Rose would spend the rest of her life in and out of institutions, her alcoholism progressing to the point where she could no longer care for herself. Crowley visited when she would permit it, bringing flowers and sitting silently while she raved about demons only she could see. The failure of his marriage forced Crowley to confront uncomfortable truths about his nature. He could inspire, instruct, and initiate, but he seemed incapable of the sustained intimacy that conventional relationships required. Perhaps this was the price of magical attainment, or perhaps it was simply a character flaw dressed up in spiritual justification. Either way, he was approaching 40, alone except for his students and his spirits, committed to a path that grew stranger and more isolating with each step forward. Standing at the threshold of the 1910s, Crowley had established himself as the most controversial occultist in Britain. He had received divine revelation, founded a magical order, and begun training a new generation of adepts. He had also alienated most of his peers, destroyed his marriage, and lost his firstborn child. The great work demanded everything, and he was prepared to pay, though he could not yet imagine how much more it would cost before he was done. The crossing to America in October 1914 marked more than a geographical transition for Crowley. Europe was consuming itself in the Great War, the old order literally exploding in clouds of poison gas and machine gun fire. The age of empires that had seemed eternal when he was born was ending in mud and blood across Flanders fields. Perhaps it was fitting that the prophet of the new aeon should arrive in the new world just as the old one committed suicide. New York City received him with characteristic indifference. Here was a metropolis too busy inventing the future to care about English eccentrics claiming divine revelation. The skyscrapers rising toward heaven suggested a different kind of spiritual aspiration, one measured in steel and dollars rather than incense and invocations. Crowley took rooms at the Hotel Brevoort in Greenwich Village, establishing himself in the heart of American Bohemia. His stated reason for coming to America was to oversee publication of his works, but deeper motivations drove him westward. Europe had become too small for his ambitions, too weighted with history and tradition. America offered virgin territory for Thelemic evangelism, a population theoretically committed to individual liberty and the pursuit of happiness. These were essentially Thelemic virtues, even if Americans did not yet realize it. The Greenwich Village of 1914 was experiencing its own revolution. Artists, writers, and radicals gathered in salons and coffeehouses to plot the overthrow of Victorian morality. Free love, socialism, he quickly attracted a circle of admirers and students drawn by his reputation, his undeniable charisma, and his seemingly inexhaustible knowledge of esoteric subjects. At parties, he would perform impromptu demonstrations of yoga that left him apparently suspended in states of cataleptic trance. He would read tarot with uncanny accuracy, revealing secrets that the querents thought safely hidden. He would discourse on any subject from Egyptian hieroglyphics to organic chemistry with equal authority. Among those drawn to him was Leah Herzig, a school teacher and aspiring opera singer, who would become his most dedicated disciple and magical partner. Leah possessed a combination of intelligence, artistic sensitivity, and sexual adventurousness that made her ideal for the magical work Crowley was developing. She also had a practical competence that helped manage the chaos that surrounded him like a personal weather system. Their relationship began conventionally enough, with literary discussions and occult instruction. But Crowley was developing theories about sexual magic that went far beyond the relatively tame practices of the Golden Dawn. He had discovered references in Eastern and Western esoteric traditions to the use of sexual energy for spiritual purposes. The tantrics of India, the alchemists of Europe, even certain Gnostic Christians had apparently practiced forms of sacred sexuality. Through careful experimentation, Crowley was systematizing these practices into what he called the supreme secret of the sovereign sanctuary of the Gnosis. Sexual arousal and orgasm, properly directed, could charge magical operations with unprecedented power. The combination of male and female energies at the moment of climax created a brief window where the magician could impress their will upon the fabric of reality. It was dangerous, potentially addictive, and absolutely forbidden by every conventional moral system, which made it irresistible to Crowley. Leah proved an enthusiastic participant in these experiments. Together they explored the boundaries between pleasure and transcendence, documenting their results with scientific precision. They discovered that different types of sexual acts produced different magical effects. Heterosexual magic tended toward creation and materialization. Homosexual magic facilitated communication with discarnate entities. Autoerotic practices enhanced personal power but could lead to delusion if overindulged. While conducting these esoteric experiments, Crowley still needed to earn money. His inheritance was nearly exhausted, spent on publishing the Equinox and maintaining the lifestyle he considered necessary for a magus. He began writing for American publications, producing everything from ghost stories to philosophical essays. He also worked as a ghostwriter, helping wealthy Americans produce memoirs and treatises they lacked the skill to write themselves. The outbreak of World War I had left him in an ambiguous position. Britain was at war with Germany, but America remained neutral. Crowley, ever the contrarian, began writing pro-German propaganda for the Fatherland, a magazine funded by German interests. His articles were masterpieces of irony, so excessive in their anti-British rhetoric that they seemed almost satirical. He claimed later that this was intentional, that he was actually serving British intelligence by making German propaganda look ridiculous. Whether this was true or post hoc rationalization remains unclear. The propaganda work brought him to the attention of George Sylvester Viereck, a German-American poet and propagandist who became both patron and puzzle. Viereck funded some of Crowley's activities but never fully trusted him, sensing correctly that Crowley served only his own agenda. Their relationship was a dance of mutual manipulation, each man trying to use the other for purposes the other only partially understood. In 1915, Crowley staged one of his most dramatic magical gestures. Standing on the docks of New York Harbor, he declared himself independent of the British Empire and tore up his British passport, casting the fragments into the water. The gesture was both sincere and theatrical, a magical act designed to free him from the constraints of nationality and conventional identity. The press reported it as the desperate act of a traitor, which served his purposes perfectly. Notoriety was a form of magical power in its own right. His American period saw the full flowering of his identity as Therion, the great beast 666, prophesied in Revelation. He signed his letters with this title, introduced himself at parties as the Antichrist, and seemed genuinely surprised when people took offense. For him, these were not blasphemous jokes, but technical descriptions of his cosmic function. The beast of Revelation was not evil, but necessary, the destroyer of outdated moralities to make room for new growth. He continued to attract students, though few lasted long in his orbit. The demands he placed on disciples were extreme, requiring not just intellectual study but complete psychological transformation. He would assign impossible tasks to break down ego resistance. He would orchestrate elaborate psychodramas designed to confront students with their deepest fears and desires. Some emerged from this training strengthened and illuminated. Others fled, convinced he was genuinely insane or actively malevolent. One student who stayed was Charles Stansfeld Jones, a Vancouver accountant who proved remarkably gifted at Kabbalistic analysis. Jones discovered numerical patterns in the Book of the Law that Crowley himself had missed, confirmations of the text's preternatural origin. Under Crowley's guidance, Jones achieved remarkable magical attainments, eventually claiming to have crossed the abyss and become a master of the temple. Their relationship would later sour when Jones developed his own interpretation of Thelema that contradicted Crowley's, but for now, he was proof that the system worked. The American years also saw Crowley refining his understanding of true will, the central concept of Thelemic philosophy. Every individual he taught had a specific purpose in the universe, a trajectory as predetermined as a planet's orbit. Most people never discovered their true will, living instead according to social conditioning and random desires. The great work of human existence was to discover and align with this will, achieving a state where every action flowed effortlessly from one's essential nature. This was not predestination in the Christian sense, because the will was not imposed from outside but arose from the deepest core of individual being. Nor was it fatalism, because discovering the will required tremendous effort and courage. It was more like a musician finding their authentic voice after years of training, suddenly able to express something that had always existed but needed development to manifest. To help students discover their true will, Crowley developed increasingly sophisticated magical and meditative practices. He adapted ancient techniques to modern psychology, creating hybrid systems that combined Eastern wisdom with Western precision. He wrote instructional texts that encoded multiple levels of meaning, forcing students to develop their intuition alongside their intellect. Every practice was a test, every achievement a gateway to greater challenges. Financial pressures continued to mount. The Equinox had ceased publication due to lack of funds. His American publishers were reluctant to take on his more controversial works. He was reduced at times to actual poverty, pawning his magical implements and rare books to pay for meals. Yet he maintained the manner of an English gentleman, dressing impeccably even when his clothes were threadbare, dining at the best restaurants even when he could not pay the bill. Leah supported him through these difficulties, both financially and emotionally. She worked as a teacher and music instructor, turning over most of her earnings to support their magical work. She endured his infidelities, understanding that sexual magic required multiple partners for certain operations. She documented his visions and revelations when he was too transported to write. She was, in many ways, the unacknowledged co-creator of mature Thelemic philosophy. By 1917, America's entry into the war made Crowley's position increasingly untenable. His pro-German writings, regardless of their actual intent, had marked him as suspicious. His unconventional lifestyle and religious views made him an easy target for patriotic hysteria. He was followed by federal agents, his mail was opened, his associates were questioned. The freedom he had sought in America was evaporating as the country mobilized for total war. He began planning his next move, envisioning a magical commune where Thelemic principles could be lived rather than merely studied. This Abbey of Thelema would be a laboratory for human transformation, a place where the new aeon could be born in microcosm before spreading to the wider world. He considered various locations, from tropical islands to mountain retreats, finally settling on Sicily as offering the right combination of isolation, cheap living, and magical atmosphere. The years in America had been productive despite their difficulties. He had refined his magical system, trained new disciples, and survived without the inherited wealth that had previously sustained him. He had learned to be resourceful, manipulative when necessary, and absolutely committed to his mission regardless of personal cost. The dilettante who had arrived in 1914 was gone, replaced by someone harder, more focused, and increasingly willing to sacrifice everything for the great work. His relationship with Leah had evolved into something beyond conventional categories. She was lover, student, priestess, and partner in a work that demanded everything they had to give. Together they had conducted magical operations that pushed the boundaries of human experience, documenting results that suggested consciousness was far more malleable than materialist science imagined. They had proven to their own satisfaction, if no one else's, that were properly applied, could reshape reality. As 1918 drew to a close, with the war ending and the old world officially dead, Crowley prepared for the next phase of his mission. The Abbey of Thelema would be his masterpiece, a functioning example of human beings living according to their true will, in harmony with cosmic law. It would also be, though he did not yet know it, the beginning of his final descent into infamy, poverty, and a peculiar kind of immortality that he could never have imagined. The villa in Cefalù seemed to have been waiting for them. Perched on the northern coast of Sicily, with Mount Etna smoking in the distance and the Mediterranean stretching to the horizon, it offered isolation without complete withdrawal from civilization. The rent was negligible by British standards, the climate was conducive to year-round outdoor ritual work, and the local population, accustomed to centuries of foreign occupiers, showed little curiosity about the strange English magician and his companions. Crowley arrived in April 1920 with Leah and 2 children she had borne him, along with a French governess named Ninette Shumway, who had become his second magical partner. They took possession of a single-story farmhouse that local people called the Villa Santa Barbara, though Crowley immediately rechristened it the Abbey of Thelema. The name was borrowed from Rabelais, whose fictional abbey operated under the rule, "Do what thou wilt," but Crowley intended to create something far more radical than Renaissance satire. The transformation of the villa began immediately. Crowley painted the walls with murals that would have been considered pornographic if they had not been so obviously religious in intent. The main temple room, which he called the Chambre de Cauchemar, or Nightmare Room, featured depictions of heaven and hell, divine and demonic copulation, and scenes from the Book of the Law rendered in vivid, primitive colors. Every surface became a teaching tool, every image a gateway to altered consciousness. Daily life at the Abbey followed a strict schedule that combined monastic discipline with libertine excess. The day began before dawn with the adoration of the sun, a ritual Crowley had adapted from ancient Egyptian practice. Residents would face east and recite invocations to Ra as the sun rose over the Mediterranean. This was followed by magical training exercises, each resident working on practices appropriate to their level of initiation. Meals were communal and ceremonial. Before eating, participants would perform a ritual blessing that consecrated the food as a sacrament. The menu depended entirely on what money was available, ranging from elaborate feasts when funds arrived to near starvation when they did not. Crowley insisted that both abundance and scarcity were magical teachings, lessons in transcending attachment to physical comfort. The afternoons were devoted to what Crowley called the great work, which could mean anything from meditation and yoga to sexual magic rituals of increasing complexity and intensity. He was developing a comprehensive system of physical, mental, and spiritual practices designed to produce accelerated evolution of consciousness. Every resident was both experimental subject and researcher. New disciples began arriving, drawn by Crowley's reputation and writings. Jane Wolfe, a Hollywood actress seeking spiritual meaning beyond the superficiality of film, became a dedicated student. Cecil Frederick Russell, an American who had corresponded with Crowley for years, arrived ready to dedicate his life to the great work. Raoul Loveday, a young Oxford graduate with a brilliant mind and delicate constitution, came with his wife Betty May, though she was sceptical of Crowley's claims and methods. Each new arrival shifted the Abbey's dynamic. Crowley orchestrated relationships and conflicts like a conductor directing a symphony of human emotions. He would assign magical partners based on astrological compatibility or karmic necessity. He would create artificial crises to test students' resolve. He would elevate someone to a position of authority, then undermine them to teach non-attachment to status. It was psychological manipulation in service of spiritual liberation. Though the distinction sometimes blurred, the magical experiments grew increasingly extreme. Crowley was convinced that conventional morality was the primary barrier to spiritual advancement. To break through required violating every taboo, transgressing every boundary that society used to maintain order. This did not mean random antisocial behavior, but systematic exploration of forbidden territories of experience. One practice involved meditating while staring at revolting objects, training the mind to maintain equilibrium regardless of external stimuli. Another required performing ritual work while experiencing extreme physical discomfort, separating consciousness from bodily sensation. Sexual magic operations pushed past pleasure into realms of intensity that bordered on violence, though always with the consent of all participants. The children at the Abbey existed in a strange paradise. Crowley believed conventional education destroyed natural genius, so his offspring received no formal schooling. Instead, they learned by observation and experimentation, absorbing multiple languages through daily exposure and developing unusual perspectives on reality. They played games that were actually magical training exercises, learned to read tarot before they could properly write, and regarded supernatural phenomena as perfectly normal. Yet darkness was creeping into the Abbey's experimental paradise. The lack of proper sanitation in the primitive villa led to recurring illness. The diet, irregular and often inadequate, weakened immune systems. The constant magical work, especially when augmented by drugs and sexual excess, took its toll on physical and mental health. Several residents began showing signs of what might have been spiritual advancement or might have been psychosis. Raoul Loveday's death in February 1923 marked the beginning of the end. He had been suffering from enteritis, probably contracted from contaminated water. Crowley, convinced that magical methods could cure physical ailments, prescribed ritual work and force of will rather than medical treatment. According to some accounts, Loveday's final magical act was drinking cat's blood during a ceremony, though this may have been sensationalist invention. Whatever the exact circumstances, he died in agony while Crowley performed banishing rituals to ease his passing into the afterlife. Betty May, Loveday's widow, returned to England with a story that the British press found irresistible. Here was the grieving widow telling of orgies and devil worship, of her husband sacrificed to satisfy the bloodlust of the self-proclaimed Great Beast. The Sunday Express ran her account under headlines that screamed about the wickedest man in the world and his Abbey of Sin. Other papers picked up the story, each adding their own embellishments until the Abbey of Thelema became, in public imagination, a site of unimaginable depravity. The truth was both less and more shocking than the press accounts. There had been no human sacrifices, no devil worship in any conventional sense, but there had been a systematic attempt to demolish the psychological and social structures that most people required to function. Crowley had created a pressure cooker of transformation that some people could not survive. Whether Loveday was a casualty of primitive living conditions or magical experimentation remained ambiguous, which was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. The British press campaign reached Italian authorities who were already suspicious of foreign communes in their territory. Mussolini had recently come to power, promising to restore order and traditional values to Italy. A colony of foreign degenerates practicing strange religions and corrupting local youth was exactly the kind of thing his government could not tolerate. In April 1923, Crowley received an order of expulsion from Italy, giving him and his followers days to leave the country. The dispersal of the Abbey's community was chaotic and painful. Some disciples, unable to imagine life outside Crowley's orbit, begged to follow him wherever he went. Others, exhausted by the intensity of communal magical life, seized the opportunity to escape. Lear remained loyal, helping to pack the magical implements and manuscripts that represented years of experimental work. The children, bewildered by the sudden disruption, clung to whatever stability the adults could provide. Crowley's final days at the Abbey were spent performing closing rituals, sealing the magical energies that had been raised over 3 years of continuous practice. He painted over some of the more explicit murals, not from shame, but to prevent them from being misunderstood by uninitiated eyes. He buried certain magical objects in locations he memorized but never revealed, insurance policies against an uncertain future. The expulsion from Italy began a period of wandering that would last for years. Tunisia, France, Germany, England, each country received him briefly before making clear he was unwelcome. His reputation preceded him everywhere, a mixture of truth, exaggeration, and complete fabrication that made normal life impossible. Hotels would refuse him rooms, restaurants would decline his custom. Even occult societies, who might have been expected to show sympathy, kept their distance from someone so thoroughly contaminated by scandal. Yet Crowley seemed to thrive on his infamy. He began referring to himself in the third person as the Great Beast with increasing frequency, as if the role had consumed the man who played it. He would introduce himself to strangers by saying he was the wickedest man in the world, then act surprised when they took him seriously. The boundary between his magical persona and his human identity had dissolved, leaving something that was neither quite deity nor quite mortal. The Abbey experiment had failed in its immediate aims. It had not created a sustainable community of transformed beings living in harmony with their true will. It had not provided a replicable model for Thelemic society. It had not even managed to maintain basic health and sanitation for its residents. But it had succeeded in ways Crowley was only beginning to understand. The intensity of the Abbey experience had accelerated magical development for those strong enough to survive it. Students who spent months at Cefalù achieved states of consciousness that might have taken decades of conventional practice. The concentration of magical energy in that small villa had created a kind of evolutionary pressure that forced rapid adaptation or breakdown. Those who adapted emerged with abilities and perspectives that seemed superhuman to conventional perception. More importantly, the scandals surrounding the Abbey had spread Crowley's name and ideas far wider than any amount of legitimate publishing could have achieved. The press might have portrayed him as a monster, but some readers detected something else in the sensationalist accounts. Here was someone who had genuinely attempted to live beyond good and evil, who had risked everything for direct experience of divinity. For certain individuals, that was irresistibly attractive. The Abbey of Thelema had been intended as a magical retirement, a place where Crowley could perfect his system while training the next generation of adepts. Instead, it became his Golgotha, the place where his crucifixion as a public figure began. But crucifixion, he knew from his Plymouth Brethren childhood, was sometimes necessary for resurrection. The great beast had been driven from his earthly paradise. Now he would wander the wilderness, spreading his gospel to anyone desperate or curious enough to listen. The England that received Crowley in 1924 treated him like a virus it was determined to expel. Hotels discovered themselves suddenly fully booked when he appeared at their doors. Landlords remembered urgent repairs that required immediate vacancy of their properties. Even the bohemian circles that had once welcomed him now kept careful distance, afraid that association with the beast might contaminate their own reputations. He had become radioactive, poisonous to anyone seeking respectability or even basic social acceptance. He settled eventually in Weymouth, a seaside resort town in Dorset that had seen better days. The Victorian grandeur was fading, paint peeling from once elegant hotels, middle-class holidaymakers replaced by those who could afford nothing better. It was a perfect setting for Crowley's own decline, though he refused to acknowledge any parallel between the town's decay and his own circumstances. He took rooms at various boarding houses, moving frequently when landladies discovered his identity or tired of his irregular payments. The choice of Weymouth was partly practical, as living costs were lower than London, but also magical. The town sat on the English Channel, facing France, across waters that had separated but also connected civilizations for millennia. Crowley believed the location was conducive to certain astral workings, allowing him to maintain magical contact with disciples scattered across Europe and America. Whether this was genuine clairvoyance or elaborate self-deception, he conducted daily rituals facing the sea, sending his will across the waters like messages in invisible bottles. His primary occupation during this period was writing his autobiography, which he titled The Confessions of Aleister Crowley. The work was intended as both vindication and provocation, setting the record straight while ensuring that the record remained thoroughly crooked. He wrote with remarkable honesty about his magical experiences while maintaining strategic ambiguity about their ultimate reality. Every chapter was a spell designed to transform the reader, whether they realized it or not. The process of writing his confessions required him to revisit every stage of his journey from Plymouth Brethren childhood to present notoriety. He approached the task with characteristic thoroughness, consulting diaries, letters, and magical records that documented decades of experimentation. What emerged was not just autobiography, but a comprehensive magical philosophy disguised as memoir. He encoded teachings in anecdotes, hid formulas in casual descriptions, and constructed the entire work as an initiatory text for those with eyes to see. Financial survival required constant improvisation. He sold what remained of his library, watching rare grimoires and first editions disappear into collectors' hands for fractions of their worth. He attempted to market his paintings, strange expressionist works created during magical trances, but found few buyers for art that seemed to radiate uncomfortable energies. He wrote articles under pseudonyms for publications that would never have printed anything under the name Aleister Crowley. The drug addiction that had been manageable during prosperous times became increasingly problematic as poverty restricted access to quality substances. He had been using heroin for years, initially as a treatment for his chronic asthma, later as a magical tool for accessing specific states of consciousness. Now it was simply necessity, the only thing that made existence bearable. He would spend days in withdrawal when funds ran out, shaking and sweating through visions that might have been magical revelations or narcotic hallucinations. Despite, or perhaps because of these difficulties, his magical work intensified. Adversity had always sharpened his abilities, and the extremity of his current situation pushed him toward breakthrough realizations. He developed new techniques for achieving gnosis through suffering, transforming withdrawal symptoms into gateways to transcendence. He discovered that humiliation could be alchemically transformed into a peculiar kind of power, that social death might be prerequisite for spiritual rebirth. Students still sought him out, though fewer than before. Those who came to Weymouth found a man physically diminished but intellectually undiminished, capable of brilliant discourse on any subject despite living in squalor. He would receive visitors in rooms that reeked of incense and illness, dressed in robes that had once been magnificent but now showed years of wear. Yet when he spoke about magic, The Gerald Gardner also entered Crowley's orbit during the Weymouth years, though their relationship was more transactional. Gardner was developing his own magical system that would eventually become Wicca, and he sought Crowley's expertise in ceremonial magic and organizational structure. Crowley provided initiation and instruction in exchange for financial support, though he privately considered Gardner's neo-pagan romanticism a regression to superseded aeon consciousness. The event that would define Crowley's public reputation for the remainder of his life began with what seemed like an opportunity for vindication. In 1934, Nina Hamnet, an artist and former acquaintance, published a memoir called Laughing Torso that mentioned Crowley in passing, referring to his magical practices and suggesting he engaged in black magic. Crowley, seeing a chance to publicly defend himself and perhaps win financial damages, sued for libel. The trial was a disaster from the beginning. Crowley's lawyer was competent but unprepared for the prosecution's strategy, which was to prove that Crowley's reputation was already so degraded that no libel could damage it further. The prosecutor, working for the defense, had assembled a comprehensive collection of Crowley's own writings, particularly passages that seemed to advocate human sacrifice, sexual depravity, and devil worship. On the witness stand, Crowley attempted to explain the symbolic nature of his writings, the difference between magical and literal truth, the complex philosophy behind seemingly shocking statements. But every explanation sounded like evasion to the jury. When asked directly if he had ever performed human sacrifice, he tried to explain that the phrase referred to the expenditure of sexual energy in magical operations, not literal murder. The courtroom erupted in shocked laughter. The judge, Mr. Justice Swift, made no attempt to hide his disgust. In his summing up, he described Crowley as the most evil man he had ever encountered in court. He instructed the jury that someone who openly called himself the Great Beast 666 could hardly complain about damage to his reputation. The jury needed only minutes to find for the defendant. Crowley was ordered to pay extensive court costs he could not possibly afford. The trial transcripts were published in newspapers across the English-speaking world, cementing Crowley's reputation as a genuine monster rather than a theatrical provocateur. Former students distanced themselves. Publishers refused to touch his manuscripts. Even occult societies that had previously shown interest now wanted nothing to do with him. He had sought vindication and achieved only deeper damnation. Yet something strange happened in the wake of the trial. The publicity, overwhelmingly negative as it was, attracted a new type of follower. These were people drawn not despite his reputation, but because of it. They sensed that someone so thoroughly condemned by conventional society might possess genuine antinomian wisdom. Letters arrived from around the world, some containing small donations, others requesting magical instruction. Crowley's health continued to deteriorate. The asthma that had plagued him since childhood grew worse with age and drug use. He developed cardiac problems that left him breathless after minimal exertion. His teeth, neglected for years, caused constant pain. Yet he continued his daily magical practices, performing invocations even when he could barely stand, maintaining his solar adorations even when leaving his bed required superhuman effort. The writing continued despite everything. He produced essays on magical theory that showed no diminishment of intellectual power. He composed poetry that ranged from sublime to deliberately offensive. He maintained extensive correspondence with students worldwide, each letter a teaching tailored to the recipient's level of understanding. The physical man might be dying, but the magical current he carried seemed to grow stronger as his body grew weaker. His living situations became increasingly precarious. He would be evicted for non-payment of rent, moved to progressively worse accommodations, maintain his magical practice regardless of external circumstances. Visitors described finding him in rooms that were simultaneously squalid and sacred, where dirty dishes shared space with consecrated magical weapons, where the smell of decay mixed with incense in combinations that suggested both death and transformation. The magical retirement he had envisioned at the Abbey of Thelema was actually occurring in the boarding houses of Weymouth, though in a form he could never have anticipated. Stripped of wealth, health, and reputation, he was being reduced to pure will, the irreducible core that survived when everything else was burned away. The crucifixion he had recognized after leaving Cefalù was continuing, each day bringing new humiliations that might be stations of the cross or steps in an initiatory process too vast to comprehend. His magical philosophy during this period achieved a kind of bitter clarity. The true will he had preached was not about getting what you wanted, but about becoming what you essentially were, regardless of comfort or social approval. The crossing of the abyss he had described required the complete annihilation of everything that might be called self, leaving only pure function in service of cosmic purpose. He was living his own teaching in the most literal way possible, though whether as saint or cautionary tale remained unclear. By 1937, Weymouth had become untenable even by his minimal standards. The landladies who would accept him were exhausted. The local tolerance for eccentricity exceeded. He began planning another move, this time to London, where anonymity might provide what provincial Weymouth's gossip networks prevented. He was over 60 years old, addicted to heroin, nearly penniless, and universally reviled. By any conventional measure, his life was a complete failure. Yet, he packed his few possessions, including the magical implements that had survived decades of wandering, with the care of someone preparing for coronation rather than further decline. London in the late 1930s was preparing for war while pretending peace would last forever. Gas masks were being distributed while dance halls played jazz. Air raid shelters were being dug while theatres staged light comedies. Into this atmosphere of determined denial, Crowley arrived like a medieval plague victim, carrying contagions that were spiritual rather than biological, but no less disturbing to those who encountered them. He took rooms in various boarding houses around Paddington and Bayswater, areas that had once been fashionable but were sliding toward genteel poverty. These neighbourhoods were perfect for someone who needed to be in London but could not afford London prices. They were full of people clinging to former status, maintaining appearances while selling family silver to pay rent. Among these declining gentry, Crowley was just another old man with pretensions and secrets. The move to London marked a shift in his magical focus. Where Weymouth had been about survival and documentation, London became about transmission. He sensed his time was limited and began working urgently to ensure his teachings would survive his death. This was not about personal immortality, but about maintaining the magical current he had carried since Cairo 1904. The Aeon of Horus would continue with or without him, but he could still influence how it manifested. His correspondence during this period was voluminous, despite arthritic hands that made writing painful. He exchanged letters with students in America, Germany, India, and Australia, creating a global network of Thelemic practitioners who might never meet but were united by their connection to him. Each letter was crafted specifically for its recipient, containing instructions, encouragement, and challenges designed to advance their particular work. Karl Germer, a German businessman who had fled the Nazis, became increasingly important as both disciple and financial supporter. Germer had achieved significant magical attainment through years of practice, including a period in a concentration camp where he had used enforced isolation to perform intensive meditation. He understood Crowley's system from the inside, having verified its claims through personal experience. More importantly, he had the organizational skills and financial resources to potentially preserve and propagate Thelemic teachings after Crowley's death. The relationship with Regardie had soured completely by this time. Regardie had published a book about his time as Crowley's secretary that the older man considered a betrayal, revealing personal details and magical secrets without permission. From Regardie's perspective, he was documenting important teachings that might otherwise be lost. From Crowley's view, Regardie had violated magical oaths and personal trust for commercial gain. The breach was irreparable, though Regardie would spend the rest of his life wrestling with Crowley's influence. New students continued to appear, drawn by curiosity, desperation, or genuine magical calling. John Symonds, a young writer, became Crowley's literary executor, though he approached the role with skepticism that bordered on contempt. Kenneth Grant, who would later claim to be Crowley's magical heir, absorbed teachings with an intensity that impressed even the beast. These younger men represented different possible futures for Thelema, though none fully understood the system they were inheriting. Grant was particularly interesting, possessing natural psychic abilities that Crowley recognized as genuine. Under Crowley's guidance, Grant began experiencing visions and magical states that confirmed theoretical teachings through direct experience. He would later develop his own interpretation of Thelemic magic that emphasized its darker, more transgressive aspects, creating a Gothic Thelema that Crowley might not have recognized, but would probably have found amusing. The paintings Crowley produced during this period were unlike anything in contemporary art. Created during magical trances or under the influence of drugs, they depicted entities and landscapes that seemed to exist in dimensions adjacent to normal reality. The technique was crude, the colors garish, but they possessed an uncomfortable vitality that suggested the artist had seen things that should not be seen. A few collectors, drawn to outsider art, purchased them for small sums that briefly alleviated Crowley's poverty. His poetry continued to flow, ranging from sublime mystical verses to deliberately shocking satires. He wrote hymns to ancient gods that managed to be both reverent and blasphemous. He composed erotic poetry that used sexual imagery to describe spiritual states, or perhaps used spiritual language to describe sexual experiences. The boundary between sacred and profane had completely dissolved in his work, creating a unified field where every experience was potentially both. The magical operations he performed in London were necessarily constrained by circumstances. He could no longer conduct elaborate ceremonies requiring physical stamina and expensive equipment. Instead, he developed minimalist practices that required only will and imagination. A single candle could become a solar system. A glass of water could contain an ocean. The microcosm and macrocosm were not just symbolically connected, but literally identical when perceived from the correct angle of consciousness. One of his most significant magical works during this period was the completion of the Book of Thoth, his interpretation of the Tarot. Working with Lady Freda Harris, an artist and fellow occultist, he created a deck that synthesized Egyptian symbolism, Kabbalistic correspondences, and quantum physics into 78 images that functioned as doorways between dimensions. The project took 5 years, with Harris painting and repainting cards as Crowley's understanding evolved. The collaboration with Harris was one of the few unambiguously positive relationships in his final years. She respected his knowledge while maintaining her independence. She supported him financially without becoming his servant. She translated his visions into images that were both beautiful and disturbing, capturing energies that had never before been fixed in visual form. Their work together produced what many consider the most powerful tarot deck ever created, though using it required courage as much as intuition. As World War II erupted, Crowley watched with a mixture of horror and vindication. The old world was literally destroying itself, just as the Book of the Law had predicted. The comfortable assumptions of progress and civilization were being revealed as illusions maintained by collective agreement. The beast that European culture had tried to suppress through Victorian morality and rationalist philosophy was emerging with mechanized violence that made his theatrical diabolism seem quaint. he attempted to offer his services to British intelligence, claiming his magical abilities could be used against the Nazis. The offer was declined, though whether from skepticism or knowledge of his earlier pro-German writings remains Despite everything, he continued teaching. Students would find him propped up in bed, surrounded by books and manuscripts, barely able to speak but still capable of profound instruction. He would assign practices, review magical records, and provide commentary that showed no diminishment of understanding. The body might be failing, but the intelligence that inhabited it remained sharp, perhaps sharpened by proximity to death. His instructions to students became increasingly urgent and practical. He was less interested in theoretical understanding than in actual attainment. He pushed them toward direct experience of magical states, knowing he would not be available much longer to guide them. He created accelerated training programs, attempting to compress decades of instruction into months. Some students broke under the pressure. Others achieved breakthroughs that would normally have taken years. The correspondence with Germer intensified as Crowley prepared for succession. He designated Germer as his heir in the Ordo Templi Orientis, the magical order he had led since the 1920s. He transferred copyrights and manuscripts, ensuring his writings would survive even if his organizations did not. He created multiple contingency plans, knowing that any single line of transmission might fail, but hoping that something would survive. He was also working on what he considered his most important theoretical work, attempting to mathematically prove the objective reality of magical phenomena. Using his training in chemistry and mathematics from Cambridge, he developed formulas that purported to demonstrate how will could influence probability. The work was never completed, existing now only in notebooks filled with equations that might be profound insights or the delusions of a dying drug addict. The magical current he had carried since 1904 was seeking new vessels. He could feel it moving through his students, sometimes successfully, sometimes destroying them as it had destroyed so many others. He had been its prophet and its victim, transformed and ruined by forces that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. Now he was preparing to release it fully into the world, knowing it would manifest in ways he could neither predict nor control. By 1945, with the war ending and the atomic age beginning, Crowley was residing at a boarding house in Hastings, barely able to leave his room. He had become a living ghost, a figure from another era who had somehow survived into a world that had no place for him. Yet students still came, drawn by something that transcended his physical decay. They found a man who had pushed human consciousness to its limits, and perhaps beyond, who had sacrificed everything for knowledge that might or might not have been real. The boarding house at 93 Jermyn Street in Hastings had that peculiar smell of English seaside decline, salt air mixed with boiled cabbage and unfulfilled dreams. The number 93 was not coincidental. In Crowley's Kabbalistic system, it represented both Thelema, meaning will, and agape, meaning love. That the universe had arranged for him to spend his final years at this numerologically significant address seemed to confirm that even apparent randomness was part of some vast pattern he could glimpse, but never fully comprehend. Netherwood, as the boarding house was called, was run by Vernon Simmons, who treated Crowley with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. The other residents, mostly elderly people waiting to die in relative comfort, regarded him as either a colourful eccentric or a genuine danger. He would appear at meals when his health permitted, dressed in robes that had once been magnificent, discussing the weather with the same intensity he brought to discussions of cosmic law. His room became a temple, library, and deathbed combined. Books were stacked on every surface, some rare editions he had somehow retained through decades of poverty, others cheap paperbacks on subjects ranging from quantum physics to detective fiction. Magical implements that had survived since his Golden Dawn days shared space with medicine bottles and syringes. The walls were covered with his own paintings and the preliminary sketches for the Thoth tarot cards that Lady Harris continued to refine. The collaboration with Harris on the tarot had become the central work of his final years. She would visit regularly, bringing new versions of cards for his approval, arguing about symbolism with the passion of someone who understood they were creating something unprecedented. The traditional tarot, used for centuries for divination and meditation, was being revolutionized to encode the entirety of Crowley's magical system in 78 images that functioned as both map and territory. Each card required multiple paintings as their understanding evolved. The Death card alone went through 8 versions before capturing the exact frequency of transformation rather than ending. The Fool, traditionally shown as a vagabond or jester, became a divine innocent dancing at the edge of manifestation, about to fall into existence with perfect trust. The Tower, usually depicted as destruction by lightning, showed the destruction of the old Aeon's eye of Shiva opening to reveal truth that destroys illusion. Harris was more than just an illustrator following instructions. She was a magical practitioner in her own right, bringing her own visions and understanding to the work. Their arguments about specific symbols or colors were not artistic disagreements, but magical operations, each fighting for their vision of how divine energies should be represented in forms that human consciousness could process. She would sometimes paint in trance states, allowing her hand to be guided by forces she did not fully understand. The war years in Hastings were marked by air raids and rationing that added external drama to Crowley's internal decline. German bombers would pass overhead on their way to London, and he would perform banishing rituals from his bed, convinced he was providing magical protection to the town. Whether coincidence or causation, Hastings suffered relatively little damage compared to other coastal towns, though this did nothing to improve his reputation among neighbors who considered him more dangerous than the Luftwaffe. Food rationing posed particular challenges for someone whose diet was already restricted by illness and poverty. He subsisted largely on porridge, supplemented by whatever his remaining students could provide. Yet he insisted on maintaining certain dietary practices he considered magically necessary, including specific combinations of foods that supposedly enhanced psychic abilities. The sight of the great beast carefully arranging his meager rations according to Kabbalistic correspondences was simultaneously pathetic and profound. Kenneth Grant continued to visit regularly, absorbing teachings with an intensity that both pleased and concerned Crowley. Grant had natural abilities that allowed him to access states of consciousness that others achieved only through years of practice. But his visions tended toward the dark and chaotic, exploring regions of magical experience that even Crowley found disturbing. Grant spoke of tunnels of Set, pathways on the reverse side of the Tree of Life, where consciousness dissolved into something that was not quite death, but certainly not life as commonly understood. During one of Grant's visits, they performed a working to contact an entity called Lamb, which Crowley had first encountered during magical operations in America decades earlier. The being that manifested, or seemed to manifest, resembled what would later be called a grey alien, with an oversized head and enormous eyes that suggested intelligence operating on different principles than human thought. Grant's drawing of Lamb, guided by Crowley's description, would later influence both occult and UFO mythology, though neither man could have anticipated this cultural cross-pollination. John Symonds visited frequently to discuss the autobiography and collect materials for what would become Crowley's literary estate. Symonds approached the material with the skepticism of someone who found the whole business faintly ridiculous, but recognized its historical importance. His questions often irritated Crowley, who wanted a hagiographer but had settled for an archivist. Yet Symonds's distance might have been exactly what was needed to preserve the materials without the distortion that true believers would have introduced. The autobiography itself would never be completed in Crowley's lifetime, existing as massive manuscripts that mix profound insight with self-justification, magical instruction with score-settling, genuine history with deliberate myth-making. He would dictate new sections when his strength permitted, revising his life story with each telling not to deceive but to reveal different levels of truth that linear narrative could not contain. Every version was accurate from a certain angle of perception. Lady Harris managed to secure a small pension for him from various sources, including some of his former students who had achieved worldly success despite or because of their magical training. This provided barely enough for survival but allowed him to maintain the heroin prescription that kept his asthma manageable and his consciousness functional. The doses required by now were enormous by medical standards, enough to kill someone without his tolerance, yet they barely maintained him at baseline functionality. His magical practice had been reduced to essentials. The elaborate ceremonies of his youth were impossible, but he discovered that consciousness itself was the only temple necessary. He would perform entire rituals in his imagination, visualizing every detail with such intensity that the astral effects were allegedly as powerful as physical performance. Students reported that his room would fill with presences during these internal workings, the temperature dropping and strange sounds emerging from empty air. The completion of the Thoth Tarot in 1943 marked a magical culmination, even as his body continued deteriorating. The cards were not just images, but functional magical machines, each one a portal to specific energetic states. Used properly, they could induce predictable alterations in consciousness, allowing users to navigate regions of experience that would normally require years of preparation to access safely. Harris had succeeded in translating Crowley's vision into forms that transmitted initiation through visual contact. Yet, publication of the deck seemed impossible. The war had disrupted everything, and there was no money for the color printing that would be necessary to capture Harris's subtle use of color as magical correspondence. Crowley spent considerable energy trying to arrange publication, knowing that the deck was perhaps his most important legacy, a complete magical system encoded in images that could survive even if all his written works were lost. His correspondence during this period took on a valedictory tone. He wrote final instructions to students scattered across the world, trying to ensure that each received the specific teachings they needed for their particular path. He designated magical heirs for different aspects of his work, knowing that no single person could carry the full current he had channeled. He created multiple lines of transmission, hoping that at least some would survive the chaos he saw approaching. The atomic bombs that ended the war in 1945 seemed to him confirmation that humanity had entered the Aeon of Horus in the most literal way possible. The power to destroy civilization had been achieved through splitting matter itself, the ultimate expression of division and analysis. Yet this same power suggested that consciousness might be similarly split and reformed, that the human atom might be broken open to release energies that would either transform or annihilate the species. By 1946, he was largely bedridden, his world shrinking to the confines of his room at Netherwood. Yet students reported that his magical presence seemed to expand as his physical form contracted. The room itself had become charged with decades of practice, every object a talisman, every wall saturated with accumulated will. Sensitive visitors claimed to experience spontaneous visions upon entering, as if the space itself had become a gateway between worlds. His final birthday, October 12, 1947, was celebrated quietly with a few students and friends. He was 72 years old, though he looked ancient beyond counting. He managed to dress in his magical robes and perform a brief ritual, his voice barely a whisper, but still carrying the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding invisible forces. Those present said he seemed to glow, though whether from fever or transfiguration remained uncertain. The end came on December 1st, 1947. His last days were spent in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and teaching, sometimes traveling in realms where no one could follow. His final words, according to witnesses, were either, "I am perplexed," or "Sometimes I hate myself," though others claimed he died silently, having said everything that needed to be said. The exact moment of death was reportedly accompanied by a violent thunderstorm, though weather records show only light rain. His death certificate listed the cause as cardiac degeneration and chronic bronchitis, medical terminology for a body worn out by extremes of experience. But those who understood his work knew that death was simply another initiation, a crossing of the ultimate abyss. He had spent his entire life preparing for this transition, mapping the territory beyond death through magical exploration and mystical experience. The funeral at Brighton Crematorium on December 5th was a strange affair. The Brighton authorities had forbidden any pagan ceremonies, but Louis Wilkinson, one of Crowley's oldest friends, defied them by reading extracts from the Gnostic Mass and the Book of the Law. As the words, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," echoed through the chapel, several attendees claimed to feel Crowley's presence so strongly that they looked around expecting to see him standing among them. His ashes were sent to Carl Germer in America, though what Germer did with them remains uncertain. Some say they were scattered in a magical ceremony designed to disseminate Crowley's essence throughout the world. Others claim they were preserved as a talisman for future magical operations. Still others suggest they were simply scattered in a garden, returning the beast to the earth from which he came. The uncertainty seems appropriate for someone who spent his life making the boundary between myth and reality deliberately ambiguous. The decade following Crowley's death was marked by deliberate forgetting. The British establishment seemed determined to erase him from history, treating him as an embarrassing episode best left unexamined. His books went out of print, his paintings disappeared into private collections, and his students either maintained discreet silence or were dismissed as cranks. It appeared that the great beast would be remembered, if at all, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of rejecting conventional morality. Yet something was stirring in the cultural underground. The same forces that had produced Crowley were still active, the tension between individual freedom and social control that had characterized the 20th century from its beginning. Young people who had survived or been born after the war were questioning the values their parents had killed and died for. In coffee shops and jazz clubs, university dormitories and artist colonies, conversations were happening that would have been familiar to anyone who had visited the Abbey of Thelema. The 1960s exploded like a magical operation performed on a global scale. Suddenly everything Crowley had advocated became mainstream counterculture. Do what thou wilt became do your own thing. Sexual liberation, consciousness expansion through drugs, Eastern spirituality, and rejection of Christian morality were no longer the province of a few occult extremists, but the defining characteristics of a generation. The Beatles put him on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, placing the beast among the people they most admired. Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin went further, purchasing Boleskine House and filling it with Crowley memorabilia. Page understood that Crowley's system was not just philosophy but technology, a set of techniques for accessing and directing energies that rock music channeled through different means. The power of rhythm and repetition to induce trance states, the use of symbolic imagery to program consciousness, the transformation of concert halls into temporary temples where thousands of people focused their will on a single experience. All of this was ceremonial magic, whether the participants realized it or not. The publication of cheap paperback editions of Crowley's works in the late 1960s introduced him to a new audience that had no connection to the British occult establishment. college students discovered the Book of the Law and found it speaking directly to their situation. Hippies read his drug writings and recognized a fellow psychonaut who had mapped territories they were just beginning to explore. Feminists found in his sexual magic a vision of female power that transcended Victorian categories, even if his personal treatment of women had often been deplorable. Kenneth Grant emerged as the most influential interpreter of Crowley's legacy, though his interpretation would have likely horrified his teacher. Grant developed a Typhonian tradition that emphasized the darker, more alien aspects of Thelemic magic. He connected Crowley's work to H.P. Lovecraft's fiction, suggesting that both men had contacted the same extra-dimensional entities through different means. Grant's books, dense with correspondence tables and descriptions of experiences at the far edges of human consciousness, created a Gothic Thelema that attracted those drawn to transgression and extremity. Israel Regardie took a different approach, presenting Crowley's techniques stripped of their more controversial elements. His books on the Golden Dawn and ceremonial magic made previously secret practices available to anyone with a library card. Regardie emphasized the psychological benefits of magical practice, presenting it as a form of psychotherapy that used symbol and ritual to integrate the personality. His sanitized version of Crowley's teachings reached people who would never have engaged with the beast directly. The Ordo Templi Orientis, which Crowley had led during his lifetime, experienced a complex resurrection. Different groups claimed to be the legitimate continuation of his organization, leading to legal battles and magical warfare between competing factions. Eventually, a California-based group led by Grady McMurtry, who had been personally chartered by Crowley, gained legal recognition. The OTO grew from a handful of aging occultists to an international organization with thousands of members, though whether it maintained Crowley's spiritual current or merely his organizational structure remained debatable. Academic interest in Crowley began in the 1970s as scholars recognized him as a significant figure in the history of Western esotericism. His influence on modernist literature, his role in the development of contemporary paganism, and his anticipation of various psychological theories made him worthy of serious study. Universities that would have expelled him as a student now offered courses examining his work. Doctoral dissertations were written on his poetry, his paintings, and his magical system. The emergence of chaos magic in the 1980s represented another evolution of Crowleyan ideas. Chaos magicians took his experimental approach to its logical conclusion, treating all belief systems as equally valid and equally arbitrary tools for consciousness change. They stripped magic of its traditional trappings, reducing it to pure technique that could be applied using any symbol system from ancient gods to corporate logos. This radical pragmatism was implicit in Crowley's scientific approach to magic, though he had maintained certain traditional structures that chaos magicians gleefully demolished. Popular culture absorbed Crowley's image while largely missing his message. He became a stock character representing generic evil in horror films and novels. Heavy metal bands used his symbols and quotes without understanding their meaning. His face appeared on T-shirts worn by people who knew nothing about him beyond his reputation as the wickedest man in the world. This superficial appropriation would have amused him, understanding as he did that symbols operate regardless of conscious comprehension. The Internet age brought unprecedented access to Crowley's works and ideas. Texts that had been available only in expensive limited editions or rare manuscripts could now be downloaded instantly. Online communities formed around Thelemic practice, allowing isolated practitioners to connect and share experiences. Virtual temples conducted rituals in cyberspace, exploring whether magical operations could be performed through digital mediation. The technology that seemed most antithetical to ancient wisdom was being used to propagate it more widely than ever before. Contemporary occultism is unimaginable without Crowley's influence. Whether practitioners embrace or reject his teachings, they must contend with the framework he established. the idea that magic should be approached experimentally rather than dogmatically, that Eastern and Western traditions can be synthesized, that sexual energy is a valid tool for spiritual work, that individual will rather than collective belief should be the basis of spiritual practice. All of these concepts that seem obvious to modern occultists were revolutionary when Crowley proposed them. The Thoth Tarot, finally published in 1969, became one of the most popular and influential tarot decks in the world. Its images, charged with decades of magical work by Crowley and Harris, seemed to possess an autonomous life that affected users regardless of their beliefs. Professional readers reported that the deck was unusually powerful but dangerous, capable of revealing truths that querents were not prepared to hear. Art historians recognized Harris's paintings as masterworks of symbolic art, belonging in museums as much as on fortune tellers' tables. Scholarly editions of Crowley's works began appearing in the 1990s with careful annotations and historical context that revealed the depth of his learning and the coherence of his system. What had seemed like random blasphemy or drug-induced rambling was shown to be carefully constructed teaching that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. His poetry, previously dismissed as doggerel, was recognized as technically sophisticated work that used traditional forms to convey non-traditional ideas. The rise of feminist and queer readings of Crowley in the 21st century revealed progressive elements in his work that had been obscured by his Victorian personality. His insistence that every person, regardless of gender, had access to divine will, his celebration of all forms of sexuality as potentially sacred, his elevation of the Scarlet Woman as equal magical partner rather than subordinate assistant, all suggested someone struggling against his cultural conditioning toward insights that would not be widely accepted for decades. Yet the controversies continue. Critics point to the genuine harm caused by his teachings when practiced without proper preparation or understanding. The emphasis on will without corresponding emphasis on compassion can produce narcissistic monsters convinced their every whim is cosmic law. The use of transgression as spiritual technique can become mere self-indulgence or worse. The rejection of conventional morality without development of individual ethics can lead to genuine evil performed in the name of liberation. Modern Thelemites struggle with how to interpret and apply Crowley's teachings in a world he could not have imagined. Should the Book of the Law be treated as immutable scripture or historical document? How can Victorian sexual magic be adapted to contemporary understanding of gender and consent? What does true will mean in an age of neuroscience that questions the existence of free will itself? These debates suggest that Crowley's work remains living tradition rather than dead dogma. His influence extends far beyond occultism into mainstream culture in ways that would astonish those who knew him as a penniless drug addict dying in a boarding house. The idea that spirituality is individual rather than collective, that personal experience trumps religious authority, that consciousness can be deliberately altered for beneficial purposes, that sexuality and spirituality are connected rather than opposed. All of these concepts that shape contemporary culture bear his fingerprints even when those accepting them have never heard his name. Museums now display his paintings and manuscripts as historically significant artifacts. First editions of his books sell for thousands of pounds to collectors who treat them as art objects. Academic conferences discuss his influence on modernism, psychology, and religious studies. The man who was denied rooms in respectable hotels now has blue plaques marking his residences. The transformation from pariah to cultural icon is complete, though whether this represents victory or defeat for his mission remains ambiguous. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that Crowley succeeded in ways he intended and failed in ways he could not have anticipated. The Aeon of Horus, he proclaimed, has manifested, though not as the triumph of individual will he envisioned, but as the collapse of all certainties into competing narratives. The magical techniques he developed are widely practiced, though often stripped of the philosophical framework that gave them meaning. His vision of human potential freed from artificial limitations has been partially realized, though the limitations that remain prove more stubborn than he expected. Standing now in the 21st century, we can see Crowley as neither the great beast nor the wickedest man in the world, but as something more complex and perhaps more disturbing. He was a man who pushed the boundaries of human experience further than most would dare, documenting his journey with scientific precision and artistic flair. He discovered or created or imagined territories of consciousness that had not been mapped before, leaving directions for those brave or foolish enough to follow. Whether his magic was real in any objective sense matters less than its reality as cultural and psychological force. He changed how Western culture understands the relationship between spirituality and sexuality, between individual will and cosmic law, between madness and illumination. He demonstrated that consciousness is more malleable than commonly believed, and that the boundaries of possible experience extend far beyond consensus reality. He proved that a single individual, armed with will and imagination, can alter the trajectory of human thought. The question he posed remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What happens when human beings accept complete responsibility for their own existence, recognizing no